Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. It was one of those nights that felt too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. The air in my apartment was heavy with the kind of unease that creeps up when everyone knows something's wrong, but no one wants to say it. I was sitting with my usual group of friends, Ryan, Claire, and Matt. We'd been hanging out for hours, aimlessly scrolling through our phones, barely talking. The atmosphere had changed since last week. Last week was when we got the news. Ben, our best friend since high school, the guy who was always cracking jokes and lighting up the room, was dead. A car accident. No warning, no goodbye. Just gone. The shock of it hadn't settled yet. Honestly, none of us knew how to deal with it. We didn't talk about him. We just sat there, pretending everything was fine. But the grief lingered between us, thick and silent. That's when Ryan spoke up. "You guys ever hear about how people use a Ouija board to talk to the dead?" he asked, his voice casual, but with an edge of something I couldn't quite place. Claire looked up, frowning. "Ryan, don't." "What?" Ryan shrugged, though his eyes had that glint they got when he had an idea, usually a bad one. "I'm just saying, what if we could talk to Ben?" I didn't say anything, but my stomach twisted at the thought. Ben was gone. He wasn't coming back. But Ryan wasn't about to let it go. "I've got a Ouija board," Ryan continued, pulling it out of his backpack like it was nothing. I don't even know how long he'd been carrying it around. We could just, ask. Matt, who'd been staring blankly at the TV, finally looked over. "Dude, come on. That's messed up." "Why?" Ryan argued. "What if we get a chance to talk to him? What if he's trying to reach out? I mean, don't you think it's worth a shot?" Claire shook her head, biting her lip. She was the most sensitive out of all of us, and I could see her fighting the instinct to leave. "I don't know, Ryan. This feels wrong. We should let him rest." But I knew Ryan. Once he had his mind set on something, there was no talking him out of it. And part of me wanted to try. I missed Ben more than I'd let myself admit, and if there was any chance, even a small one, that we could hear from him again. "Let's just see what happens," I said quietly, surprising myself. Everyone turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of disbelief and unease. "You're serious?" Matt asked, raising an eyebrow. I shrugged, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's the worst that could happen? It's probably just going to be nothing." Claire sighed, glancing between us before finally giving in. "Fine. But if anything feels off, I'm out." Ryan grinned, setting the board on the coffee table. The letters and numbers seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and the little planchette in the center looked more ominous than it had any right to be. We all sat around the table, the room growing eerily quiet as we put our fingers on the planchette. Ryan took a deep breath, his voice serious for the first time all night. "Ben, if you're there, can you give us a sign?" At first, nothing happened. I expected as much. The planchette stayed still, the air in the room thick with anticipation. Claire shifted uncomfortably, glancing around like she was waiting for something to jump out at her. But then, it moved. It was subtle at first, just a slight twitch, and I figured one of us had accidentally nudged it. But then it slid, slow and deliberate, toward the letters. B-E-N. The planchette stopped, and we all stared at it in stunned silence. "Someone's pushing it," Matt muttered, pulling his hand away like the board had burned him. "I'm not," Claire whispered, her eyes wide. She looked terrified, but her fingers stayed on the planchette, trembling slightly. Ryan swallowed hard, his voice shaking. "Ben, is it really you?" The planchette moved again, this time faster, sliding toward yes. My heart pounded in my chest, the room suddenly feeling too small, too dark. "This is insane," Matt said, his voice strained. "Ben's gone. This can't be real." I wanted to agree with him, but the air in the room felt different now, heavier, colder. It wasn't just a game anymore. Something was happening. Ryan leaned forward, his voice soft. "Ben, if you're really here, can you tell us what happened?" The planchette paused, and for a moment, I thought the whole thing was over. But then it moved again, spelling out a single word, HELP. Claire's breath caught in her throat. "Help? Why would he need help?" Ryan's face paled. "Ben, what do you mean? How can we help you?" The planchette moved faster now, almost frantic, spelling out the same word over and over again. HELP, HELP, HELP. I pulled my hand away, my skin crawling. This doesn't feel right. But Ryan wasn't done. "Ben, where are you?" The planchette stopped abruptly, then jerked toward the numbers, spelling out something none of us expected. 1-1-0-9. 1-1-0-9. Over and over, the same numbers, repeating again and again. "What does that mean?" Matt asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ryan's face had gone white. "That's Ben's address." The room fell into a stunned silence. I stared at Ryan, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "Wait, that's impossible," Claire said, her voice trembling. "Ben's gone. He can't be at his house." Ryan shook his head, pushing the board away from him. "I don't know, but we need to go." Claire stood up, her hands shaking. "We're not actually doing this, are we? Going to his house in the middle of the night because a Ouija board told us to. This is insane." But Ryan was already grabbing his keys, and despite every instinct in me telling me to stay put, I found myself standing up, ready to follow him. Something wasn't right. We had reached out to Ben, and somehow we had gotten a response. But if Ben was asking for help, why did it feel like he wasn't really gone? We were in the car within minutes, the air thick with a mix of fear and disbelief. None of us spoke much as Ryan drove toward Ben's house, 1109 Sycamore. The address kept repeating in my head like a broken record. Why had the Ouija board spelled that out? And why had Ben, if it was really him, asked for help? It didn't make sense. The streets were nearly empty as we made our way through the quiet suburban neighborhood. The streetlights cast long shadows, flickering slightly in the cool breeze. The houses seemed ordinary enough, but tonight, everything felt different. More off. The closer we got to Ben's place, the more the air felt charged with something I couldn't describe. Ryan pulled up in front of Ben's house, cutting the engine. The place looked just like it always had. A normal 2-story house with a well-kept lawn and a porch light that was still on, casting a pale glow across the front yard. It was as if nothing had changed, except everything had changed. "We shouldn't be here," Claire whispered from the back seat, her voice trembling. "This is crazy. We're chasing some message from a Ouija board. Ben's gone, Ryan. We need to accept that." Ryan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. What if he's not? What if he needs us? Matt, who had been quiet most of the drive, finally spoke up. "Look, I don't believe in this stuff, okay? But if this is just some weird coincidence, then we check it out and we go home. But if something's really happening, we can't ignore it." I nodded, though the knot in my stomach kept tightening. "Let's just be careful." We got out of the car and stood there for a moment, staring at the house. Everything was still. No movement, no sound. Just the faint hum of the porch light and the eerie quiet of the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the windows, even though I couldn't see anything. Ryan led the way up the driveway, his steps slow and deliberate. The rest of us followed, our footsteps unnervingly loud in the silence. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure everyone could hear it. As we reached the front door, Ryan hesitated, glancing back at us. Should we knock? Matt let out a nervous laugh. I mean, what are we expecting? For Ben to just answer the door? But Ryan didn't laugh. He raised his hand and knocked 3 times, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. We waited. At first there was nothing, just the oppressive silence pressing in around us. I could feel my breath catching in my throat, the anxiety crawling up my spine. Claire shifted nervously beside me, her eyes darting around the front yard like she expected something, or someone, to jump out at us. Then, from inside the house, we heard it. A soft thud. We all froze, eyes wide, staring at the door. It wasn't much. A single sound, like something being dropped on the floor. But it was enough to make my blood run cold. There's someone in there, Ryan whispered. Ben's parents? Claire asked, her voice shaky. Maybe they're home. But we all knew that wasn't possible. Ben's parents had left town for a while after the accident, unable to handle staying in the house. The place was supposed to be empty. Ryan tried the door handle, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door swung open with a quiet creak, revealing the dark hallway beyond. I couldn't see much from where I stood, just the outline of the stairs and the faint glow of a nightlight somewhere deeper inside. My heart was racing, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave. But Ryan stepped inside, and Matt followed close behind. Claire hesitated at the threshold, glancing at me with wide, scared eyes. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest, and followed them in. The house was eerily still, the air heavy with the scent of dust and something else, something faint but unsettling. It smelled damp, like old wood left to rot. We stood in the entryway for a moment, the weight of the house pressing down on us. The soft hum of the nightlight did little to ease the growing tension. Ben? Ryan called softly into the dark. His voice echoed back to us, bouncing off the walls in a way that made my skin crawl. We moved further into the house, our footsteps muffled by the carpet. Everything looked exactly as I remembered it, the framed photos on the walls, the clutter of shoes by the door. It was like stepping into a memory that had warped into something darker, something wrong. We reached the living room, where the faint glow of the nightlight cast long, eerie shadows across the furniture. It felt cold in there, colder than it should have been, and the silence was almost unbearable. Then, out of nowhere, a voice. Help me. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It came from upstairs. We all froze, exchanging wide-eyed looks of terror. That voice, it sounded like Ben. Ryan didn't hesitate. He started toward the stairs, his face pale but determined. Ben? Ben, is that you? I wanted to stop him, to tell him to wait, but the words caught in my throat. My legs felt heavy, like they were stuck to the floor, but I forced myself to move, following Ryan up the stairs. Every step creaked under our weight, the sound too loud, too unnatural in the quiet house. Claire clung to my arm as we ascended, her breath shaky. "This is wrong," she whispered. "This is so wrong." When we reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before us, dark and foreboding. The door to Ben's room was slightly ajar, and the faintest sliver of light spilled out from inside. Ryan walked toward it slowly, his hand trembling as he pushed the door open. Inside, the room was empty. The bed was made, the desk cluttered with papers and random stuff, just like it had always been. But there was no one there, no sign of Ben. But the air felt thick, oppressive, like something was lurking just out of sight, hiding in the corners where the light didn't reach. Ryan turned to us, his face a mask of confusion. I heard him. I swear I heard him. And then, from behind us, the door to the bathroom at the end of the hall creaked open, just a crack. Another whisper drifted out, soft and pleading. "Help me." My blood ran cold. We all turned toward the bathroom door, our bodies frozen with fear. The whisper, Ben's voice, had come from inside. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my skin prickled with the cold realization that we were far deeper into something than we had ever imagined. Ryan, as always, was the first to move. He stepped toward the bathroom, his hand trembling as he reached for the door. "Ben!" he called out, his voice shaky. "If it's really you, we're here." I wanted to tell him to stop, to leave the door alone, but I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. If Ben was gone, then who, what, was asking for help? The door creaked open wider, revealing the faint glow of a dim light coming from inside the bathroom. We couldn't see anything yet, just the edge of the sink and the shadows it cast on the walls. Ryan took a deep breath and stepped inside. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stay put. But then I heard that voice again. "Help me!" It was clearer this time, and it sounded just like Ben. There was no mistaking it. I swallowed hard and followed Ryan into the bathroom. What I saw made my stomach turn. The mirror above the sink was fogged up, like someone had just taken a hot shower, though the air was cold and there was no steam. Scrawled across the surface of the mirror, in uneven, dripping letters, was a single word: help. I took a step back, my body trembling. "This can't be happening," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. The fear in my voice was unmistakable, and Claire clung to my arm, her eyes wide with terror. Matt stepped forward, staring at the mirror in disbelief. How did that get there?" Ryan turned to us, his face pale. "It's him. Ben's trying to reach us." "No," Claire said, shaking her head, her voice rising in panic. "No, it can't be. Ben's gone, Ryan. He's dead. This isn't real." But Ryan wasn't listening. He moved closer to the mirror, his fingers reaching out as if to touch the letters, as if he could somehow feel Ben's presence through the glass. The air in the bathroom felt heavier now, colder. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my heart racing faster, the adrenaline pumping through me as the realization of what we were dealing with began to sink in. Then the light flickered. It was subtle at first, just a quick dimming, but then it flickered again, longer this time. The entire bathroom seemed to shift, the shadows growing darker, deeper, stretching out across the floor like they were alive. Suddenly, the door behind us slammed shut with a deafening crash. We all jumped, the sound echoing through the small space. The light flickered again, then went out completely, plunging us into total darkness. "Ryan," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What's happening?" "I don't know," he replied, his voice barely audible. "But we need to find Ben. He's asking for help." "I don't think it's Ben," Matt said, his voice tense. "I think we've done something we can't take back." The darkness around us felt suffocating, pressing in from all sides. My breath came in shallow gasps as I fumbled for my phone, desperately trying to turn on the flashlight. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to it. Finally, I managed to switch on the light, casting a narrow beam across the bathroom. The fogged-up mirror reflected the light back at us, the word help still scrawled across the surface, but the room felt different now. The shadows were thicker, more oppressive, like they were swallowing up the light. Ryan turned toward the door and reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "We're locked in," he said, his voice strained. Claire whimpered beside me, her fingers gripping my arm tightly. I knew this was a bad idea. I knew it. Suddenly, there was another sound. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and they echoed through the darkness, coming from somewhere outside the bathroom. My heart lurched in my chest, and I turned the flashlight toward the door, but there was nothing. Just the sound of those footsteps moving closer and closer. Ryan pounded on the door, his voice rising in panic. "Ben, is that you?" The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The silence was so thick it felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. My pulse was racing, my skin crawling with the sensation that someone, was standing just on the other side of the door. Then, from the other side of the door, we heard it again. "Help me." It was Ben's voice, but there was something wrong with it. It sounded distant, distorted, like it was coming from deep underwater. The tone was all wrong, too. More desperate, more urgent, like he was in pain. Ryan's face went pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Ben!" he called out again, his voice trembling. The footsteps resumed, this time faster, heavier, as if someone, or something, was running down the hallway outside. The sound echoed through the house, growing more frantic with each step. My heart raced as the footsteps reached the door and then stopped abruptly. I turned to Ryan, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here." Before anyone could respond, the door flew open with a violent crash, but there was no one there. The hallway beyond was empty, the darkness swallowing up the light from my phone. I shone the flashlight around, trying to see if anyone was out there, but the house was silent, too silent. Ryan took a step toward the hallway, his breath shaky. "Ben, where are you?" And then the bathroom mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, glass exploding outward as if something had hit it from the inside. Shards flew across the room, cutting through the air like tiny knives. I ducked instinctively, raising my arm to shield my face, but I could still feel the sharp sting of glass slicing across my skin. When I looked up, the mirror was gone, replaced by an empty, gaping hole where the reflection used to be. The word "help" was still visible on the fogged glass, but now it seemed to glow faintly in the dark, as if something had burned it into the surface. "Enough," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to leave." But just as she said it, a low, guttural whisper came from the shattered mirror. "I'm still here." My heart skipped a beat. The voice wasn't Ben's anymore. It was something else, something darker, more menacing. The air in the room grew colder, so cold I could see my breath. Ryan stood frozen, his eyes locked on the empty space where the mirror had been. "Ben," he whispered, but I knew it wasn't Ben. The bathroom felt impossibly small now, the cold biting through our clothes as the shattered glass crunched beneath our feet. My flashlight flickered, casting fleeting glimpses of the broken mirror and the foggy word "help" still etched on the surface. But the voice, that deep guttural whisper, "I'm still here," had changed everything. It wasn't Ben anymore. It couldn't be. "Ryan," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We need to go. Now." He didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the space where the mirror had been, his face pale, as if he was in a trance. Matt stepped forward and grabbed his shoulder, shaking him. "Ryan, snap out of it, man. This isn't Ben." Ryan blinked, his breath coming out in shallow gasps as he tore his gaze away from the broken mirror. I thought..." He trailed off, his words lost in the icy air. Claire tugged at my arm, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Please, let's leave. I don't care what that thing is, but it's not Ben." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of the house. Something had answered us when we tried to reach Ben, but whatever it wasn't our friend. It had lied, and now we were trapped with it. "Come on," Matt urged, pulling Ryan toward the door. "We're leaving." We moved quickly, huddling close together as we stepped out of the bathroom and into the dark hallway. The air was heavy, thick with tension, and the silence pressed down on us like a weight. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, but I could still see the faint outline of the stairs at the end of the hall, leading down to the front door. The way out. Ryan's breathing was shallow, his eyes darting around the hallway like he was expecting something to jump out at us. I couldn't blame him. I was too. Every shadow felt alive. Every creak of the old house sent a fresh wave of fear through me. We made it to the top of the stairs, and I glanced back at the hallway behind us, half expecting to see something lurking in the dark. But it was empty. At least, it looked empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that had been with us since the Ouija board. Suddenly, Claire stopped, her hand gripping my arm so tightly it hurt. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. At first, I didn't know what she was talking about. The house was still, eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. But then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, barely audible, coming from somewhere nearby. It was subtle, but unmistakable, the kind of sound that claws at your mind, begging for attention. We all froze, listening. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, like something was trying to claw its way through the walls. "What is that?" Matt whispered, his voice tight with fear. Ryan looked around, his eyes wide. "It's coming from inside the walls." I turned my flashlight toward the wall next to us, and for a moment I saw nothing, just the peeling wallpaper and the faded paint. But then the wall shifted. It was subtle at first, like the surface was moving, undulating. I took a step back, my heart racing. "Something's in there," Claire whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to leave." We started moving faster, heading down the stairs, our footsteps quick and quiet as the scratching grew more desperate, more aggressive. The whole house seemed to be waking up around us. The walls creaked and groaned, the air growing colder with each step. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, making it hard to think, hard to focus. Halfway down the stairs, the scratching stopped. I paused, turning my head toward the wall again, my flashlight flickering as the silence returned. The air was thick with tension, so heavy it felt like I couldn't breathe. And then, the footsteps returned. They started softly at the top of the stairs, like someone, or something, was walking toward us. But these weren't normal footsteps. They were uneven, heavy, like something was dragging itself down the hallway. My blood ran cold. Ryan stopped dead in his tracks, his hand gripping the banister as he turned to look back up the stairs. His face was as pale as a ghost, his eyes wide with terror. "Run," he whispered, his voice barely audible. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the stairs, our footsteps pounding against the old wooden steps as we raced toward the front door. The sound of those dragging footsteps grew louder behind us, closer. I could hear the scraping of something heavy against the floorboards, like it was following us, hunting us. We reached the bottom of the stairs and sprinted toward the door, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. Claire reached the door first, fumbling with the lock, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get it open. "Hurry!" Matt shouted, his voice filled with panic. The door finally swung open, and we stumbled outside into the cold night air, our hearts racing, our bodies trembling with adrenaline. I turned to look back at the house, half expecting to see something standing in the doorway, but the house was still, silent, as if nothing had happened. We didn't stop running until we were halfway down the street, the cold air burning our lungs. We huddled together on the sidewalk, panting, trying to catch our breath. No one said anything for a long time. Ryan was the first to break the silence. His voice was hollow, barely above a whisper. "That wasn't Ben." Matt nodded, his face pale. "Whatever that was, we need to stay away from it. That thing in the house. It's not him." Claire wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. "What have we done? We shouldn't have used that board. We opened something we can't close." I didn't know what to say. She was right. We had reached out to our friend, but we had found something else. Something dark, something dangerous. And now, it was with us. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent. But I knew, whatever we had let in, It wasn't confined to that place. It had followed us. I could feel it, lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. We had asked for Ben's help, but now it was too late to ask for our own. We stood in the middle of the street, breathless, the night air biting at our skin as we huddled together, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind was spinning, but one thing was clear. Whatever we had reached out to, whatever had answered us, was not Ben. It wasn't even human. We had brought something back with us. Ryan was the first to speak, his voice strained, barely above a whisper. "It's not over, is it?" Claire shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No, I can still feel it, like it's following us." I didn't need to be told. That oppressive presence was still with us, thick in the air, making the night feel darker than it should. Every shadow seemed deeper, more alive, as if the darkness itself was waiting for us to let our guard down. "We need to get out of here," Matt said, his voice cracking. "Go somewhere with people, light, anywhere but here." Ryan looked back at the house. His hands were shaking, his face ashen. "I don't think we can outrun this." "We have to try," I said, though deep down I wasn't sure if we could. The thing we had summoned wasn't bound by walls or doors. It had found us once, and it wasn't going to let us go that easily. We started walking quickly, almost running, away from the house, our footsteps echoing on the empty street. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see something lurking in the shadows, something dragging itself toward us. But the street was eerily still. Too still. The silence around us felt unnatural, like the entire world was holding its breath. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart in my ears and the crunch of gravel under our feet. "Do you think it's still in the house?" Claire asked, her voice shaky. "No," Matt said, his voice flat. "It's with us now." Just as the words left his mouth, the streetlights ahead flickered and went out. We stopped dead in our tracks, staring into the darkness that had swallowed the road. The air around us grew colder, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, making your muscles tense and your breath catch in your throat. I could feel it, the presence, closer now, circling us like a predator. "Run," Ryan whispered. We took off, sprinting down the street as fast as we could, but the darkness seemed to move with us. The streetlights behind us flickered and died one by one, like a wave of blackness chasing us down. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I couldn't stop. Not now. But no matter how fast we ran, the feeling never left. That crawling sensation of something watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. We reached an intersection, panting, our breaths forming clouds in the freezing air. There were no cars, no people, just us and the growing darkness that seemed to pulse with life. Ryan stumbled to a stop, bending over, gasping for breath. "We can't keep running forever." Claire looked around, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Then what do we do? How do we stop this?" I didn't have an answer. None of us did. And then I heard it again. The voice. It was faint, like it was coming from a great distance, but it was unmistakable. "Help me." My blood ran cold. It was Ben's voice again, but distorted, wrong, like it was being twisted through layers of static. It echoed from the darkness, and I could feel it creeping closer, the weight of it pressing down on me. Ryan's face went pale, his eyes wide with fear. "It's trying to lure us back." "We're not going back," Matt said, shaking his head. "Whatever that thing is, it's not Ben." "But what if it is?" Ryan's voice wavered, torn between fear and desperation. "What if he's trapped? What if he needs us?" "We can't," Claire said firmly. "We've done enough. We need to protect ourselves." Suddenly, a gust of wind swept down the street, howling through the trees, sending leaves scattering across the ground. The temperature dropped even further, and I could feel the cold pressing in from all sides. The streetlights ahead flickered weakly, casting long, flickering shadows across the pavement. And then, from the darkness, something moved. It was a figure, tall, twisted, its limbs long and unnatural, dragging behind it as it emerged from the shadows. Its movements were jerky, wrong, like a puppet being yanked on invisible strings. My heart stopped. It didn't have a face, just a blank, featureless head that seemed to absorb the light around it. The figure stopped at the edge of the flickering streetlight, its body swaying slightly, as if it was watching us, waiting. What is that?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryan stepped back, his face pale, his hands trembling. "We summoned it. We brought it here." The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence pressing down on us, heavy and suffocating. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, of being hunted. This was the thing that had answered us when we reached out to Ben. This was what we had let in. "We need to go," Matt said urgently, grabbing Ryan's arm. "Now." But as we turned to leave, the figure moved. It stepped forward, its body shifting and contorting, dragging itself toward us with slow, deliberate steps. The sound of its movements, wet, scraping, echoed through the empty street. My legs felt like lead, frozen in place as the thing got closer, the air around it growing colder with every step. "Run!" I shouted, pushing Ryan ahead of me. We bolted down the street, our footsteps pounding against the pavement, but the figure followed, its movements impossibly fast despite its grotesque form. I could hear the scraping, the wet dragging sound, growing louder behind us. My heart was racing, my vision tunneling as we sprinted for our lives. We turned a corner, desperate for any place to hide, but the streets were empty, the houses dark. The world felt abandoned, like we were the only ones left in this nightmare. Just as I thought we couldn't go any further, Matt stumbled and fell to the ground with a cry of pain. "Get up!" I screamed, grabbing his arm, but it was too late. The figure was right there, looming over us, its shadow stretching out like it was swallowing the light. The air was so cold I could barely breathe, and my limbs felt heavy, sluggish. I pulled Matt to his feet, but the figure wasn't moving anymore. It just stood there, watching us. Then, for the first time, it spoke, not with words, but with a voice that echoed in my mind. A voice that wasn't human, a voice that was older than anything I could comprehend. "You called me. You brought me here. Now, you're mine." The cold swept over me, chilling me to the core. I could feel its presence, crawling inside my thoughts, pulling me down into the darkness. My vision blurred, and I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "We made a mistake," Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible. "We never should have reached out." The figure's form shifted, and as it did, I felt the ground beneath me tremble, the air thick with something heavy and ancient. It wasn't just after us, it was feeding off our fear, our desperation. And as the darkness closed in, I realized there was no way out, no escape. We had summoned something far worse than we ever could have imagined. It was supposed to be just another Friday night. The four of us, me, my girlfriend Emily, my best friend Josh, and his brother David, were hanging out at my apartment, bored out of our minds. We'd already cycled through Netflix, messed around with some video games, and eaten way too much pizza. The mood was restless, like we were all waiting for something interesting to happen. That's when Josh suggested it. "I found this old Ouija board in my parents' attic," he said, pulling out a worn wooden board from his backpack like it was no big deal. "Thought it might be fun to mess around with it." Emily shot him a look. "Seriously, Josh? A Ouija board? That's the best you've got?" "Hey, it's better than sitting around doing nothing," he replied with a grin. "Besides, don't you want to know if this stuff actually works?" David, always the skeptic, shook his head. "You can't be serious. Those things are just cardboard and parlor tricks. It's all nonsense." But something about the idea intrigued me. I'd always been on the fence when it came to the paranormal. Part of me wanted to believe, but the rational side of me always thought it was all just smoke and mirrors. Still, with nothing better to do and the night stretching on ahead of us, I shrugged. Why not? Let's give it a shot. Josh grinned, clearly pleased with my agreement, and set the board on the coffee table. It looked old, like it had seen better days. The letters were faded, the yes and no symbols barely visible, and the planchette was scratched up like it had been used a lot. There was something about the board that gave me a weird feeling, like it had a history, like it had been part of things we couldn't quite understand. We all sat around the table, fingers on the planchette, feeling slightly ridiculous, but still intrigued by what might happen. Josh took charge, his voice low and serious, trying to set the mood. If there's anyone here with us, any spirit that wants to communicate, show us a sign, move the planchette. At first, nothing happened. The room was quiet, just the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint sound of traffic outside. Emily rolled her eyes and leaned back in her chair, clearly unimpressed. Yeah, Josh, I'm pretty sure it's not going to work. But then, the planchette twitched. At first, I thought one of us had moved it by accident. But then it slid, slowly, deliberately, toward the letter H. We all went quiet, staring at the board, unsure of what to make of it. Who's moving it? David asked, his voice tense. I'm not, Emily replied quickly. I wasn't either, and I could tell from the look on Josh's face that he wasn't behind it either. The planchette kept moving, spelling out a series of numbers. 10468772. We all stared at the board, confused. Is that a phone number? Emily asked, her voice low. Josh frowned, leaning closer to the board. Looks like it. David let out a nervous laugh, trying to lighten the mood. All right, whoever's playing around needs to quit it. This is ridiculous. But no one was laughing. I could feel the tension in the air, that creeping sense of unease that builds when something is just off. The board had given us a number, and none of us had any idea what to do with it. Josh was the first to break the silence. Should we call it? David scoffed. You want to call some random number that came from a Ouija board? Yeah, sure, that's a great idea. But I could tell Josh wasn't going to let it go. He pulled out his phone, fingers hovering over the keypad. Come on, what's the worst that could happen? It's probably just a coincidence. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't stop him. I guess part of me was curious too. Curious about what would happen if we called the number, if there was some kind of connection between us and whatever had given it to us. Josh punched in the number, 10468772. We all leaned in, waiting as the phone rang. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Then, just as I was about to suggest hanging up, the ringing stopped. But no one answered. There was just silence on the other end of the line, so heavy and thick, it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. Josh frowned and pulled the phone away from his ear, glancing at the screen. It connected, he said, but no one saying anything. Then I heard it. Faint at first, barely noticeable, but there was no mistaking it. Breathing, slow, laboured breaths, like someone was on the other end of the line, but they couldn't or wouldn't speak. The sound sent a chill down my spine, and I could see the same reaction on everyone else's faces. Emily's eyes went wide, and David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Josh put the phone back to his ear, his expression tense. Hello? Is anyone there? No response. Just more breathing. It was deep, rasping, like the person, or whatever it was struggling to take each breath. The sound grew louder, more pronounced, filling the silence in the room with an eerie, unnatural rhythm. Josh's face went pale, and he quickly hung up, dropping the phone onto the table like it had burned him. We sat there in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The number from the Ouija board, the strange breathing on the other end of the line. It all felt too real, too disturbing to brush off as a prank. Emily was the first to speak, her voice shaky. What was that? I don't know, Josh replied, his eyes still fixed on the phone. But that was definitely not normal. David leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Maybe it was just a bad connection, or some freak accident. But I could tell none of us really believed that. Something was wrong. The board had given us that number for a reason, and whatever was on the other end of the line wasn't just a coincidence. "We should stop," I said, my voice low. "We shouldn't mess with this anymore." But deep down, I knew it was already too late. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with something we couldn't quite name. The phone number, the strange, laboured breathing, it all sat between us like an invisible weight, pressing down on any attempt to shrug it off. We didn't say much for a few minutes, just exchanged uneasy glances, trying to figure out what had just happened. Emily broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're not calling that number again, right?" Josh looked like he was still processing everything. His usual confident grin was gone, replaced with a furrowed brow and tense jaw. He glanced down at the Ouija board, then back at his phone. "I don't know, man," he muttered. "It could have been some kind of glitch, or maybe a prank." "You think someone planned this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Like someone knew we'd be using a Ouija board tonight and just waited for us to call that number." Josh shrugged, but he didn't look convinced. None of us did. David, always the skeptic, tried to act like he wasn't rattled. "It was probably nothing. Just some weirdo breathing into the phone. Creepy, sure, but not supernatural." Emily shot him a look. "You heard that, right? That wasn't normal." Josh ran his hand through his hair, clearly agitated. "All right, let's just put the board away and forget about it. I'm sure it's nothing." But just as he reached for the board, his phone lit up. We all froze, staring at the screen as it buzzed on the table. The number flashing across the display made my stomach drop. 104-6872. The number we'd just called. Josh hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the phone. His face had gone pale, and I could see the fear creeping into his expression. It's the number," he whispered. "Don't answer it," Emily said quickly, her voice sharp. "Josh, don't." But Josh, being Josh, didn't listen. His fingers shook slightly as he picked up the phone and put it to his ear. The rest of us sat in tense silence, watching him, waiting for something to happen. "Hello?" he said, his voice wavering. There was a long pause. Josh's eyes darted around the room as he listened, and I could tell from his expression that he wasn't hearing what he expected. More breathing. I didn't need to hear it to know. I could see the way Josh's face tightened, the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the phone. The same slow, heavy breathing, like whoever or whatever was on the other end of the line was waiting for something. Waiting for us. Josh yanked the phone away from his ear and hit the end button, tossing it back onto the table like it had suddenly grown hot. "Did they say anything?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "No," Josh said, shaking his head. Just the breathing, the same as before." Emily wrapped her arms around herself, her voice shaking. "We need to stop this. Put the board away. We're done." I nodded, fully in agreement. "Yeah, we should have never started this. Whatever this is, it's not good." But David, stubborn as ever, wasn't convinced. "Come on, guys. It's just some freaky coincidence. The call could have been automated. One of those spam numbers that loop weird sounds. It's not like we're dealing with anything paranormal here." I wasn't sure I could believe that. Not after the way the number had come from the board, and not after what we'd heard. But David's words hung in the air, offering a fragile sense of logic in a situation that felt anything but logical. Josh sighed and started packing up the Ouija board, carefully placing the planchette back in the box. Fine, we'll stop. No more calls." We all breathed a little easier after that, but the tension didn't fully leave the room. It clung to the air like smoke, making everything feel a little too quiet, a little too still. After a few minutes of awkward silence, David stood up, stretching like he was trying to shake off the nerves. "Well, that was fun, but I think I'm going to head out. This whole thing's just weird, and I need to clear my head." Josh nodded. Yeah, I think we all do. Let's just forget about this, okay? We said our goodbyes, and one by one, they left. Emily was the last to go, but before she walked out the door, she turned to me, her eyes full of concern. Be careful, okay? Whatever this is, it doesn't feel right. I gave her a weak smile, but deep down, I knew she was right. I will. Text me when you get home. She nodded and closed the door behind her, leaving me alone in the apartment. I sat down on the couch, staring at the Ouija board that Josh had left behind. The number flashed in my mind. 10, 4, 6, 8, 7, 2. The way it had come through the board, the breathing, it gnawed at me. What if it wasn't over? What if that thing wasn't done with us? My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen and felt my heart stop. 104-6872, the same number again. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the phone. My thumb hovered over the screen, ready to decline the call, but something made me pause. A sick sense of curiosity maybe, or fear. Either way, I answered it. I put the phone to my ear, bracing myself for the sound I knew would come. The breathing, but this time it was different. Instead of the slow, laboured breaths, there was a new sound. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. It sounded like someone was trying to speak, but the words were garbled, like they were trapped in water. My heart raced, my mouth dry as I strained to hear. Then the whisper grew louder, clearer, until I could finally make out the words. I'm coming. The line went dead. After the whisper, those two words, I'm coming, everything felt different. The atmosphere in the apartment was thick, like the air itself had taken on weight. I sat there, frozen, staring at my phone, hoping I had misheard. But I knew what I had heard was real, and worse, it wasn't a mistake. For a few minutes, I couldn't move. My mind raced, cycling through every possible explanation. Could it have been a prank? A glitch? Someone messing with us from the other side of the line? But none of it made sense. The way the number had come through the Ouija board, the eerie breathing, the whisper, it wasn't random. It felt deliberate, like something had chosen to connect with us, and now it wasn't letting go. I stood up and paced the room, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me like a second skin. The room felt too dark, too quiet, and every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far. My thoughts spiraled, and I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. I needed to do something. Anything. I grabbed my phone and texted Josh, my fingers trembling as I typed. Me. Did you get another call? I stared at the screen, waiting for the little dots to pop up, but they didn't. I glanced at the clock. It was late, but not too late for Josh to answer. He was probably just ignoring his phone, brushing off what had happened earlier. After all, we'd all agreed it was nothing, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I started to dial Emily's number, but before I could hit call, my phone buzzed again. I almost dropped it, my heart jumping into my throat. 104-6872, the number, again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I hit decline immediately, my hands shaking. I couldn't deal with that whisper again, that breathing, whatever was waiting for me on the other end of the line. Not now, not alone. But then, my phone buzzed again. This time, a text. From 104-6872. Why did you hang up? I stared at the screen in disbelief, my skin crawling. My first instinct was to throw the phone across the room, but I forced myself to keep reading. The message was there, staring back at me, taunting me. Before I could even process it, another text came through. From 104-6872, I'm closer now. A chill ran down my spine, colder than anything I'd ever felt before. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as my mind raced with panic. Closer? Closer where? How could it be closer? It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But I felt it, like something was moving through the darkness, unseen, but undeniably there. I grabbed my keys, deciding I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. I needed to get out, be somewhere with other people, somewhere with light. The walls felt like they were closing in, and every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. I didn't care where I went, I just needed to get out of there. As I reached the door, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voicemail. I stared at the notification, my finger hovering over the play button. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave it there, unheard, but I couldn't. Something pulled me in. With shaking hands, I hit play. The voicemail started with the same breathing, slow, deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was on the other end of the line was trying to make sure I knew they were there. The sound filled the silence in the room, and I could feel my pulse quicken, the dread clawing at my insides. Then, the breathing stopped, replaced by a low, distorted whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but as I pressed the phone closer to my ear, I heard it clearly. "I'm outside." My blood turned to ice. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stand there, staring at the door like it was about to burst open. My heart pounded in my chest, the panic rising in waves as the reality of the situation crashed over me. Something was outside. I moved slowly, my body stiff with fear, and peered through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty, bathed in the dim, flickering light of the old apartment building. There was no one there. Nothing. But the voicemail had said otherwise. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was overreacting. But the number, the breathing, the whispers, it all felt too real to be a coincidence. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain, and it was getting closer. My phone buzzed again, pulling me out of my thoughts. This time, it wasn't the number. It was a text from Emily. "Emily, are you okay?" Something weird happened. I immediately called her, my voice shaky as I spoke. "Emily, what's going on?" She answered on the first ring, her voice tense. "I got a call, from the number, the same number as before." My stomach dropped. "Did you answer?" "No," she replied quickly. "I let it go to voicemail, but the voicemail, it was just breathing, and then a whisper. It said," she paused, her voice trembling. "It said it was outside." I closed my eyes, trying to keep my voice steady. I got the same message. There was a long pause on the line, both of us trying to process what that meant. "I'm coming over," Emily said finally. "We shouldn't be alone." "Yeah," I agreed, my voice tight. "Hurry." I hung up, pacing the room as I waited for her. Every second felt like an eternity, and the silence in the apartment was unbearable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. My eyes kept darting to the door, expecting it to fly open at any moment. A knock at the door made me jump. It was too soon for Emily to have gotten here. My pulse raced as I stepped toward the door, heart pounding in my chest. I could feel my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. Another knock, louder this time. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw the screen. 104-6872 is calling. The knock came again, louder and more urgent, as the phone continued to buzz in my hand. I backed away from the door, my breathing ragged, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything. But I was frozen. The line was still ringing. The knocking had stopped. And in the silence that followed, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was outside the door, it wasn't Emily. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my ears as the knocking ceased. The only sound now was the incessant buzzing of my phone. 104-6872 flashing on the screen again and again. My fingers hovered over the decline button, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. My entire body felt like it was locked in place, my breath stuck in my chest. Who or what, was behind the door. The phone kept ringing. Another knock came, quieter this time, almost tentative, as if whoever was on the other side knew I was hesitating. I glanced at the peephole again, half expecting to see some twisted figure lurking outside, but the hallway was just as empty as before. Still, the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I finally pressed decline, silencing the phone. I couldn't handle another second of hearing that number come through. I took a few slow steps backward, keeping my eyes locked on the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. From 104-6872. I'm waiting. My blood ran cold. I dropped the phone onto the couch, unable to look at it anymore. The words seemed to crawl off the screen, burrowing into my mind. I'm waiting. Waiting for what? Waiting for me to open the door? Waiting for me to let them in? The knock came again, louder, more insistent now. My body jerked, and I nearly let out a gasp. I couldn't just stand there, waiting for whatever was on the other side to decide it was ready to come in. I had to move, had to do something. But my legs felt like lead, my chest tight with fear. Just as I was about to force myself to leave the room, my phone buzzed again. Another text. From Emily. I'm outside. Let me in. A wave of relief washed over me. Emily. She had made it. Of course it was her. I had been psyching myself out, letting the fear take control. I hurried toward the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. But just as I was about to pull the door open, I stopped. Something felt wrong. Too wrong. Why hadn't I heard her car pull up? Why hadn't she texted me before knocking? I stepped back, my hand still on the doorknob. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, and when I looked down, my heart dropped into my stomach. From Emily. I'm parking now. Be there in 5. I stared at the message, my mind racing. She wasn't here yet. Then who was knocking? The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Whoever, whatever, was at the door had been pretending to be Emily. It knew I was expecting her. It had known what to say, what to do, to make me think it was her. My breath caught in my throat as the knocking grew louder, more frantic. The door rattled in its frame, like something was trying to force its way in. I backed away from the door, stumbling over my own feet as I tried to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. My mind raced, trying to come up with some plan, something that would keep it out. The apartment felt small, claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in. Then the voice came, muffled but unmistakable. Let me in. It sounded like Emily's voice, but wrong. Office. It was like someone was imitating her but missing all the natural warmth and familiarity. The voice was too low, too slow, dripping with something inhuman. I'm right here. Just open the door. I covered my mouth with my hand, trying to stifle my breath. I didn't move. My pulse was pounding in my ears, the fear so intense I thought I might pass out. The knocking stopped for a moment, and then the voice came again, quieter this time, almost coaxing. You don't have to be scared. I'm just here to talk. I felt sick. The bile rose in my throat and I could barely breathe. Every fibre of my being was screaming at me not to open that door, not to listen to the voice. Whatever was outside, it wasn't Emily. It wasn't human. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was playing a game with me. Suddenly my phone buzzed again. From Emily. I'm coming up the stairs now. My hands trembled as I read the message, my mind racing. Emily was about to walk into this nightmare, and I had no way of warning her. I wanted to scream, to shout for her to stay away, but my throat felt too tight, the fear choking off my voice. The knocking stopped abruptly. The voice, too, went silent. The air in the room felt heavier, as if something was watching me, waiting. My eyes darted toward the peephole again, but I couldn't bring myself to look through it. Then I heard it. Footsteps coming up the stairwell. Real ones this time. Normal human footsteps. the familiar rhythm of Emily's sneakers on the concrete. Please, God, let it be her, I whispered to myself, my voice shaking. A soft knock came at the door, and I froze, waiting. Hey, it's me, Emily's voice called from the other side. I'm here, let me in. I moved slowly toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. Emily! Yeah, she said, her voice sounding normal this time. Open up. I pressed my eye to the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. It was her, Emily, standing there looking tired but safe. There was no sign of whatever had been knocking before. No shadowy figure, no strange presence. Just her, standing in the dim light of the hallway, looking confused and a little worried. I unlocked the door and swung it open, my body still shaking. Thank God, I muttered, pulling her inside. You wouldn't believe what just happened. She looked at me confused, her brow furrowing. What do you mean? Are you okay? I shook my head, still trying to catch my breath. The knocking. There was something at the door. It wasn't you. I thought... My voice trailed off, realizing how insane I must have sounded. But Emily's face went pale. What do you mean someone was here? I don't know, I said, my voice trembling. I thought it was you, but it wasn't. It was pretending to be you. She swallowed hard, glancing at the door nervously. And you didn't see who it was? I shook my head. Number. But it wasn't human. It couldn't have been. Emily shuddered, her voice dropping to a whisper. What do we do now? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at it, and my stomach dropped when I saw the number. 104-6872. I didn't answer this time. I didn't need to. I already knew what it wanted. The phone continued to buzz in my hand. The number, 104-6872, flashing relentlessly on the screen. I stared at it, paralyzed by the weight of what I knew was coming. The game wasn't over, not even close. Whatever was on the other side of that call was waiting, growing more insistent with each unanswered ring. Emily stood beside me, her eyes wide with fear. Don't answer it, she whispered, her voice trembling. Just don't. I wanted to agree, to turn off the phone, throw it across the room, anything to make the number go away. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't stop it. Whatever had come through that Ouija board, whatever had attached itself to that number, wasn't going to leave us alone. The buzzing stopped, leaving the room in suffocating silence. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, but before I could even think about what to do next, my phone buzzed again. A voicemail. I stared at the notification, my hands shaking. I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to know what it had to say, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. With a deep breath, I pressed play. At first, it was the same as before. The heavy, labored breathing. Slow and deliberate, like whoever was on the other end of the line wanted me to know they were there. The sound crawled into my ears, making my skin prickle with fear. Then came the voice, distorted and garbled, as if it were coming from deep inside a tunnel. You can't run. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as if they'd been spoken directly into the room, not through the phone. We are already inside. My heart stopped. I looked around the apartment, every shadow seeming darker, every corner more threatening. The air grew heavy, like something was pressing down on my chest. Emily's eyes met mine, her face as pale as mine must have been. What does that mean? She whispered, her voice barely audible. But I knew. I could feel it. An overwhelming sense of dread, like something unseen was closing in on us. The apartment felt smaller, more confined, as though the very walls were shrinking around us. I could feel the presence, the same one I'd felt at the door, except now it wasn't just outside. It was here, with us. Emily backed toward the center of the room, her eyes darting around in panic. Do Do you feel that? I nodded, unable to speak. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I could feel it, that cold, suffocating energy creeping closer, like invisible fingers reaching out from the shadows. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then they went out completely. We were plunged into darkness. Emily let out a small gasp, and I grabbed her hand instinctively, pulling her close. The room was silent, but the silence was worse than the sound. It was too thick, too unnatural, like the air itself had gone still. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be hiding in that darkness, what could be watching us. Then I heard it, the faint sound of breathing, but it wasn't coming from my phone anymore. It was coming from inside the room. I froze, my blood running cold as the sound grew louder. Deep, rasping breaths, the kind that make your skin crawl. It wasn't far from us. I could feel it, close enough that I could almost reach out and touch it. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded, my grip tightening on her hand. The breathing continued, slow and steady, but I couldn't see where it was coming from. The darkness was too thick, swallowing up every inch of the room, leaving us blind and helpless. Then, from the corner of the room, came the voice. "I'm here." It was the same voice from the calls, from the voicemails. Deep, distorted, inhuman. My heart nearly stopped. The air grew colder, and I could feel the presence moving toward us, closer and closer. "We need to go," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own pounding heart. "Now!" But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a violent crash, the sound echoing through the apartment. Emily let out a cry, her grip tightening on my hand, as we both stumbled backward, away from the door. The breathing grew louder, surrounding us now, as if whatever was in the room was closing in from every direction. My head spun, my pulse racing as I realized there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The voice came again, closer this time, almost right beside us. "You can't leave." Emily pressed herself against me, her breath shaky. "What do we do?" I didn't know. My mind was a blur of fear and panic, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in this room with us wasn't going to let us go. Not easily. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. The room was empty. The door stood closed, but nothing was there. Nothing visible, at least. But the air was still heavy, the presence still looming. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed Josh's number. I didn't know what else to do. He was the one who had brought the board, the one who had started this. Maybe he knew something, anything that could help us. The phone rang, and then it stopped. But instead of Josh's voice, all I heard was the breathing. My blood turned to ice. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at it in disbelief. The call had connected. It was Josh's number, but it wasn't him on the other end of the line. It was them. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. The line went dead, the apartment falling into an eerie silence once more. And then, the voice returned, but this time, it wasn't coming from the phone. It was inside my head. "We're not done." Emily's eyes met mine, wide and terrified. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She could see it in my face. The game wasn't over. It had never been just about the number. We had opened a door, and now something had come through. Something that wasn't going to leave until it had what it wanted. We had made a terrible mistake, and now we were trapped. As the lights flickered once more and the shadows deepened around us, I realized the awful truth. We weren't alone, and we never would be again. It started like any other Friday night. Just me, Claire, Josh, and Liz hanging out in Josh's basement. His place had always been our go-to spot since it was big enough for us to mess around without his parents getting annoyed. We'd spent countless nights there, playing video games, eating junk food, and talking about nothing in particular. But that night felt different. Maybe it was the cold autumn wind rattling the windows, or the eerie silence outside that made everything seem a little too still. We'd already gone through a couple of rounds of cards and were half-heartedly watching some old horror movie when Claire, who'd been scrolling through her phone, perked up. "I brought something," she said, her voice breaking the lull in conversation. Josh raised an eyebrow, looking more interested than he had been all night. "What is it? Some weird TikTok challenge?" "Not exactly." Claire reached into her bag and pulled out a wooden Ouija board. It looked old, the edges worn, and the letters slightly faded. "I found this at a thrift store a few weeks ago. Thought we could give it a try." Liz groaned, leaning back against the couch. "Seriously, Claire? You know that stuff's a load of crap, right?" I could tell Claire wasn't convinced. She placed the board on the table with a grin that was both excited and nervous. "Yeah, but it's fun, and who knows, maybe we'll get a message from beyond." Josh chuckled, clearly intrigued. "I'm down. What's the worst that could happen?" I wasn't so sure. I'd never really been into paranormal stuff, but I'd heard enough stories to know that messing with a Ouija board wasn't always just a game. Still, I didn't want to be the killjoy, so I shrugged. "Sure, why not?" We gathered around the table, the basement suddenly feeling smaller, the air a little heavier. Claire placed the planchette in the center of the board, her fingers trembling slightly. Liz rolled her eyes, but joined in, placing her fingertips on the planchette along with the rest of us. Josh, ever the joker, was the first to speak. "All right, spirits, if you're out there, we want to talk. Move this thing if you're listening." Nothing happened at first. Just silence. The faint hum of the TV in the background, the soft creak of the house settling. I glanced at Claire, expecting her to laugh it off, but she looked focused, her eyes locked on the board. We sat there for what felt like an eternity, the mood growing more awkward by the second. "Maybe you need to ask something more specific," I said, trying to break the tension. Claire nodded, her voice softer this time. "If there's anyone here with us who wants to communicate, please give us a sign. Move the planchette." Again, nothing. Liz let out an exaggerated sigh. "Told you. It's just a..." Before she could finish, the planchette twitched. We all froze, eyes widening as we stared at the board. The movement had been subtle, almost like a small shiver, but it was enough to send a ripple of unease through the group. Josh chuckled nervously. "Nice try, but one of you definitely moved it." "I didn't," Claire said quickly, her voice tense. "I swear. I hadn't moved it either. I wasn't even sure I could if I wanted to." My fingers felt glued to the planchette, too nervous to make any sudden motions. "Let's try again," Claire said, her voice more serious now. "If someone's here, what do you want?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the steady ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint rustle of the wind outside. I was about to suggest we call it a night when the planchette slid, slow but deliberate, across the board. WHO. "Who?" Josh muttered, frowning. "Who what?" The planchette moved again, this time faster. ARE. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Liz looked visibly uncomfortable now, her bravado fading. "Okay, this is getting weird." Josh was grinning like an idiot, clearly loving the tension. "Who are we? Is that what it's asking?" Claire's voice was shaky now. "Maybe it's asking who we are, like it wants to know." That thought didn't sit well with me. The idea of something on the other side trying to figure out who we were, it felt too personal, too invasive. Josh leaned in, his voice playful. "We're just some random kids, all right? Now what do you want?" The planchette didn't move at first, and I started to hope that maybe whatever it was had given up. But then it began to shift, slowly at first, then picking up speed. YOU. We all stared at the board, the words sinking in like a stone dropped into the pit of my stomach. "You," Liz whispered, her voice barely audible. "It wants... us?" Josh's grin faded, replaced by something more serious. This is just a joke, right? One of you is messing with it. But no one moved. We were all too stunned, too rattled by the word that had formed in front of us. Claire looked pale, her fingers trembling. Maybe we should stop. No, Josh said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Let's ask it something else, something simple. He glanced at me, his eyes filled with an excitement that didn't quite match the unease in the room. Go on, ask it something. I hesitated, my mind racing. I didn't like this, not one bit. But something inside me, maybe curiosity, maybe stupidity, forced me to speak. What do you mean by you? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The planchette moved instantly this time, almost as if it had been waiting for the question. The movement was sharp, direct. T-A-K-E. My breath caught in my throat. The tension in the room was unbearable now. No one said a word, but I could feel the fear radiating off of everyone. Josh tried to laugh it off, but even he was rattled. All right, we've had our fun. Time to pack it up. But the board wasn't done. The planchette moved again, faster, more aggressively. Y-O-U. Take you. I yanked my hands away from the planchette, the cold fear settling deep in my bones. We need to stop, now. Claire was already shoving the board back into her bag, her face pale and her hands shaking. This was a mistake, a huge mistake. Josh stood up, rubbing his hands on his jeans like he was trying to shake off the tension. It was just a game. Nothing happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened. Something we couldn't see, but could definitely feel. The air in the room was heavy, oppressive, like we had invited something in that wasn't leaving. As we left Josh's house that night, the word repeated in my mind over and over again. Take you. We didn't talk much after that night at Josh's. The whole thing left us with an uncomfortable silence, the kind you don't want to fill because no one's quite sure what to say. We all went home, but the weight of the Ouija board session stayed with me, like a shadow creeping at the edge of my vision. Something about the word you, the way the planchette had moved so deliberately, felt too real, too intentional. The next few days were quiet, but that was when things started to change. It was subtle at first, little things. I'd leave a room and come back to find the door slightly ajar, even though I knew I had closed it, or the lights would flicker just long enough to make me wonder if I was imagining it. I didn't think much of it until the third night after we'd used the board. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The house was still, the kind of quiet that normally comforts you, except that night, it felt unnerving. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept replaying that night with the board, the word you echoing over and over in my head. At some point I must have dozed off, but it wasn't long before I woke up to something strange. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, heavy, like something was holding me down. My eyes were open, but everything around me was dark, too dark, even for the middle of the night. The shadows seemed thicker, denser, as if they were alive. I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt glued to the bed. Panic gripped me as I realized I wasn't alone in the room. Something was standing in the corner. I couldn't see it, not clearly, but I felt it. The weight of its presence was suffocating, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I strained to see through the darkness, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it, a shape. Tall, unnaturally thin, barely visible in the shadows. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, to thrash, to do anything, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own body, as that thing, whatever it was, stood there, silently observing. Then it spoke. Not out loud, but in my head, a voice so cold and so close that it sent a shiver down my spine. I'm here for you. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen in terror, but eventually the darkness seemed to lift. The weight on my chest eased, and I could move again. I bolted upright in bed, gasping for air, my skin drenched in cold sweat. The room was empty now. The shadow in the corner was gone. But I knew it had been real. That voice, it wasn't a dream. The next morning, I texted Claire. Me. Anything weird happened to you since Friday? She replied almost immediately. Claire. Yeah. I don't want to talk about it over text though. Can we meet up? We agreed to meet at a coffee shop later that day. When I walked in, Claire was already sitting at a table, her eyes darting nervously around the room like she was expecting something to follow her. She looked pale, like she hadn't slept in days. Hey, I said as I sat down. What's going on? You look... I can't sleep, she interrupted, her voice low, almost a whisper. Ever since that night, I keep waking up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone's in my room, watching me. My heart sank. I thought it was just me. Claire's eyes widened. You felt it too. I nodded. It started a couple of nights ago. I woke up and I couldn't move. There was something in my room, standing in the corner. It told me it was here for me. Claire shivered, her hands trembling as she clutched her coffee cup. This can't be happening. It was just a stupid game, right? We didn't really invite something in, did we? I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But it doesn't feel like a game anymore. Before we could say anything else, my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced down and saw a message from Josh. Josh, we need to talk. Now I looked up at Claire, showing her the screen. It's Josh. He says we need to talk. Her face paled even more, if that was possible. Do you think it's happening to him too? There's only one way to find out. We met up at Josh's house that evening. Liz was already there when we arrived, looking just as shaken as Claire. The mood in the room was tense, like we were all on edge, waiting for someone to break the silence. Josh didn't waste any time. Has anyone else been seeing things? He asked, his voice strained. We all exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear none of us wanted to admit it, but we couldn't deny it anymore. I've seen something, Liz said quietly, her usual sarcastic tone gone. At first, I thought I was just imagining it, but I keep waking up in the middle of the night, and there's someone in my room. I can't move, I can't scream, and it just stands there, watching me. My stomach churned. It was the same thing I'd experienced, the same thing Claire had experienced. Josh rubbed his face with his hands, looking exhausted. Same here. I thought it was just stress or lack of sleep, but it's too real. Every night I wake up and there's this figure standing in the corner. It doesn't do anything. It just watches. Claire's voice trembled. What do we do? Josh shook his head. I don't know. But whatever we messed with that night, it's not done with us. And I think it's getting closer. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of our shared fear sinking in. None of us knew what to say, because deep down, we all knew the truth. We'd invited something in, and now it wasn't leaving. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of everything sinking in. None of us wanted to admit how scared we were, but it was obvious. We were in way over our heads. That thing, whatever it was, had followed us home, and now it was getting closer, watching, waiting. Josh was the first to break the silence. We have to do something, he said, his voice shaky but determined. We can't just let this keep happening. Liz nodded, though she looked like she was barely holding it together. But what do we do? This isn't something we can just ignore. It's real, and it's coming for us. I don't know, Josh admitted. But we can't just sit around and let it take us. Take us. The words hung in the air like a bad omen, and I could feel my stomach twist. That's what it had said on the Ouija board, wasn't it? Take you. The same word, over and over. It hadn't made sense then, But now, with everything that had been happening, it felt like the answer had been right in front of us all along. It wanted us. Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. What if it's already too late? Josh shook his head, trying to stay calm. Number. It's not too late. We just need to figure out how to get rid of it. There has to be a way. I could see the panic in his eyes, the fear he was trying to keep at bay. We all wanted to believe that there was a solution, something we could do to stop whatever we had unleashed. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, after we left Josh's house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The streets were empty, the cool autumn air biting at my skin, but every time I glanced over my shoulder, I felt it, that invisible presence, watching me, just out of sight. I got home, locked the door behind me, and checked every room in the house. Nothing. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It clung to me like a shadow, making my skin crawl and my heart race. I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the house, every distant sound outside, made my heart skip a beat. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in, thicker than usual. My mind raced, replaying every strange thing that had happened since we'd used the Ouija board. The shadow in my room, the voice, the word, you. It was all connected, but I didn't know how to stop it. Sometime in the middle of the night, I must have fallen asleep because when I opened my eyes, the room was bathed in that eerie pre-dawn glow. But something was wrong. I couldn't move. It was happening again. My body felt heavy, pinned to the bed by some unseen force. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to move, to make a sound, but nothing happened. I was paralyzed, just like before, and that feeling of being watched washed over me like a wave of cold air. The shadow was back. It stood in the corner of my room, barely visible in the dim light, its form tall and impossibly thin. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me. Those unseen, piercing eyes that seemed to strip away any sense of safety I had left. I'm here for you. The voice echoed in my head again, colder this time, more insistent. It wasn't just a presence anymore. It was a threat, a promise. I fought against the paralysis, my body screaming for release, but it was useless. I couldn't move, couldn't escape. The shadow seemed to grow darker, more solid, as if it was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every second that passed. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the weight lifted. I bolted upright in bed, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow was gone, the room empty, but the terror lingered. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling, and texted Claire. Me. It happened again. It was in my room. I don't know what to do. Her reply came almost instantly. Claire. Same here. I couldn't move. It was standing by my bed. What is this thing? I didn't have an answer. None of us did. Whatever we had summoned wasn't going away. It was getting stronger, and it was coming for us. Over the next few days, the visits became more frequent. Every night, without fail, I would wake up to that same feeling of paralysis, that same shadow lurking in the corner of my room. Sometimes it would speak, its voice cold and distant, but always the same message: I'm here for you. I could barely sleep. I felt like I was losing my mind. Every waking moment was filled with the dread of what would happen when I closed my eyes. I wasn't alone in this. Josh, Claire, and Liz were all experiencing the same thing. We were being hunted by something we didn't understand, something we couldn't see, but we all knew it was only a matter of time before it made its move. One night, after another restless evening, I decided to confront it. I didn't know what else to do. I was desperate, exhausted, and terrified, but I needed answers. If this thing wanted me, then I was going to face it. I waited in bed, my heart racing as the hours passed. Midnight came and went, and the house was silent. I lay there, staring into the darkness, waiting for the shadow to return. And then, just as I had expected, it did. The familiar weight pressed down on my chest, and I felt the paralysis set in. My body refused to move, but my mind was sharp, focused. The shadow appeared in the corner, just like before, tall and menacing. But this time, I was ready. "What do you want?" I asked in my mind, forcing myself to stay calm. "Why are you here?" The voice came, clearer than ever, its tone dripping with malice. "You!" A cold shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't just a haunting. It wasn't just some ghost or entity messing with us for fun. It wanted us, wanted me, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it came for. Before I could ask anything else, the weight lifted, and I shot up in bed, drenched in sweat. The room was empty again, but the message was clear. It was coming for me. And soon. After that night, things got worse. The shadow wasn't just a distant figure lurking in the corner of my room anymore. It was becoming bolder, closer. I couldn't escape it, no matter where I went. I'd see its shape flickering in my peripheral vision during the day, its presence a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. It was stalking me, creeping closer with every passing moment. We all felt it. Claire, Josh, and Liz were in the same situation. The late-night texts between us had become more frantic, more desperate, as we tried to figure out what was happening to us and how to stop it. But the more we talked, the more hopeless it seemed. We had no idea what we were dealing with, no idea what we had summoned, and now it was closing in. I hadn't slept in days. The lack of rest was getting to me, making me jump at every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that moved just out of sight. The thing was toying with us, wearing us down until we had nothing left. I could feel it chipping away at my sanity, slowly but surely. That night, I sat in my room, wide awake, waiting for the inevitable. I knew it would come, like clockwork, it always did. The dread that built up throughout the day was unbearable, but there was no escaping it. So, I stayed awake, my eyes darting around the room, waiting for the darkness to shift, for the shadow to make its move. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. It started like usual. The room grew colder, the shadows deepening as the clock ticked closer to midnight. I braced myself, knowing the paralysis would set in soon. But tonight, it was different. As the minutes passed, the cold became unbearable, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I could feel it, more present than ever before, pressing against my skin, the weight of its attention bearing down on me. I tried to move, but my body was frozen, locked in place as the darkness seemed to pulse around me. And then I heard it. Not in my head this time, but right next to me. "You're mine now." The voice was right beside my bed. My heart stopped. Every muscle in my body tensed. The fear so intense, it felt like my chest was about to explode. Slowly, I turned my head toward the source of the voice, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow was no longer in the corner. It was right next to me. I couldn't make out its features, if it even had any, but I could feel its presence looming over me, cold and suffocating. It was real, more real than it had ever been, and it wasn't just watching anymore. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was trapped with this thing that had been haunting me for days, weeks. My eyes widened as I watched its form shift and flicker, like it was struggling to maintain its shape. But it didn't move away. It leaned in closer. I could feel the cold radiating from it, the deep, unnatural chill that seemed to cut straight through my bones. My skin prickled with the sensation of something just brushing against it, and I knew this was it. This was what it had been waiting for. "I'm here for you," it whispered again, its voice sending shivers down my spine. In the darkness, I saw something else. A flash of white, its eyes, or maybe its teeth. I couldn't tell, but it was enough to break me out of my paralysis. enough to make me fight back against the overwhelming fear. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to sit up, to move, to push this thing away from me. The room felt like it was closing in around me, but I didn't care. I scrambled out of bed, barely able to breathe, and ran to the door. My hands shook so violently that I could barely turn the knob, but somehow I managed to get out. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. I stood there in the street, panting, my heart hammering in my chest, as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. That thing, it wasn't just watching anymore, it was coming for me. The next morning, I called Josh. I couldn't do this alone. None of us could. We needed to figure out what was happening, how to stop it, before it took any of us for good. Josh picked up after a few rings, his voice tired and strained. "Dude, you okay? You sound freaked out." "I can't do this anymore," I blurted out, my voice shaky. "It's getting closer. It's not just watching. It's here, in my room. I don't know what to do." There was a long pause on the other end, and when Josh finally spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "Same here. It was at the foot of my bed last night. I don't think we have much time left." "We need to meet up," I said quickly. "All of us. We need to figure this out before it's too late." "Yeah, I'll call Claire and Liz," Josh replied. "We'll meet at my place tonight." That night, we gathered at Josh's house again. The atmosphere was even more tense than before, like the air itself was buzzing with nervous energy. Claire looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, and Liz kept glancing over her shoulder, like she expected something to come up behind her. "We have to stop this thing," Liz said, her voice cracking. "I don't know how much more of this I can take." Josh nodded, pacing the room. "I've been looking into this. People who mess with Ouija boards and summon something they can't control. They say the only way to get rid of it is to break the connection. We have to go back to where it started." Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" "We need to use the Ouija board again," Josh explained. "We need to ask it how to make this stop. We opened a door, and the only way to close it is to ask it how." My stomach turned at the thought. The last thing I wanted to do was touch that board again, but I knew Josh was right. We didn't have a choice. That night, we gathered around the Ouija board in Josh's basement, just like before. But this time, the air was different, heavier, darker. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer, the lights dimmer than they should have been. Josh placed the planchette in the center of the board, and we all placed our fingers on it, just like before. My heart raced as I braced myself for what was about to happen. Josh spoke first, his voice trembling slightly. "What do we have to do to make you leave us alone?" For a moment, nothing happened. The room was dead silent, the only sound our shaky breaths. Then the planchette moved. Take. We all froze, our eyes wide as the planchette moved again, spelling out the rest. ONE. "Take one," Liz whispered, her voice barely audible. "What does that mean?" The room felt colder, the shadows pressing in around us. We didn't need to ask. We all knew what it meant. It wanted one of us. The planchette sat still in the center of the board, the final word, one, hanging in the air like a death sentence. None of us moved. None of us spoke. We all knew what it meant. It wanted one of us. It had always wanted one of us. The weight of it crashed over me like a wave. I felt sick to my stomach. The silence in the room was unbearable, each second ticking by, making the tension thicker, more oppressive. The shadow that had been haunting us, the thing that had whispered in our ears and watched us from the corners of our rooms, had made its demand. It wouldn't stop until it had what it came for. Josh broke the silence first. His voice was shaky, barely controlled. "We can't give it what it wants. There's got to be another way." Claire looked pale, her eyes darting between each of us, the fear raw on her face. "But what if we don't give it what it wants? What happens then?" "We die," Liz whispered, her voice flat, almost numb. "Or worse." I wanted to argue, to fight against the horror of what Liz had said, but deep down, I knew she was right. The thing had been hunting us for days, watching us, toying with us. It was patient, but now it had given us an ultimatum. Take one, and it wasn't going to leave without a sacrifice. What do we do? Claire asked, her voice trembling. How do we choose? We don't, Josh said, his voice hardening. We can't. We'll find another way to deal with this. But how? I thought. How do you reason with something like this? Something that isn't even human, that isn't bound by the rules we understand. Before anyone could answer, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then they went out completely, plunging the room into total darkness. I felt the cold immediately, the same bone-chilling cold that had gripped me every night since we'd used the board. It was here. The presence was stronger now, so much stronger than it had been before. I could feel it all around us, pressing in from the shadows, suffocating. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to keep my fear under control, but it was no use. It was too close, too real. And then, from the darkness, came the voice. I'm waiting. The voice was louder this time, no longer just a whisper in our heads. It echoed through the room, deep and distorted, like it was coming from all directions at once. Take one, and I will leave the rest. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a heavy thud in my ears. I felt the others shift beside me, felt their fear radiating through the room, just as strong as my own. We were trapped. There was no running from this, no hiding. We had to make a choice. But how could we? I can't do this, Claire whispered, her voice breaking. I can't choose. Josh's breath was shaky, his words barely audible. None of us should have to. Liz spoke up, her voice tense. Maybe it wants the person who brought the board. Maybe that's how it works. Claire gasped, horror spreading across her face. You can't mean... Josh shook his head, cutting her off. No one is sacrificing anyone. That's not how we handle this. But the shadow moved. I could feel it shift closer, circling us, making its presence known. It was growing impatient, its demand hanging over us like a blade ready to drop. I can't take this anymore, Liz whispered, her voice shaking. I don't want to die. I swallowed hard, my mind racing, desperate for a way out. Desperate for something, anything, that didn't end with one of us being taken. Then I felt the cold air behind me, like someone had leaned in close. The voice was right at my ear this time, so clear it made my skin crawl. You. My blood ran cold. The message had been for me all along. I had known from the start, hadn't I? Ever since that first night, the voice whispering, the figure standing in my room. It had always been me. Josh turned to me, his eyes wide. What do we do? I could barely think. The cold was everywhere now, the presence overwhelming. But deep down, I knew what had to happen. It had made its choice. It wants me, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Claire gasped. Number, you can't. I have to. My heart was pounding in my chest, but the words came out steady. I stood, the air around me growing colder with each passing second. I could feel the shadow pressing in, like it was waiting for me to make the final move. I don't know how else to stop this, I said, my voice trembling but firm. It's not going to leave until it gets what it wants. Josh reached for me, his face pale. Don't do this, man. There's got to be another way. But there wasn't. I knew there wasn't. I can't let it take all of us, I said, my voice quieter now, the weight of the decision crushing me. Maybe if I go, it'll stop. It'll leave you guys alone. The room was silent, the cold unbearable. I took a step forward, toward the center of the darkness, where the presence felt strongest. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know what it wanted with me. But I knew this was the only way to protect the others. Take me. I whispered into the cold air. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was still, the air heavy, and I wondered if I'd made a mistake, if I'd just condemned us all. But then, the shadows shifted. The cold lessened. The presence began to fade. The voice, soft but final, whispered through the room one last time. Good choice. And then it was gone. The lights flickered back on, the room warmer, the tension lifting. I stood there shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to process what had just happened. The others were staring at me, wide-eyed, but I could see the relief on their faces. It was over. I don't know why it spared me. Maybe because I offered myself willingly, or maybe because it had gotten what it wanted, our fear, our submission. But it never came back after that. The cold, the shadow, the voice. It was all gone. We never talked about it again. We didn't need to. We all knew what had happened, what we had almost lost. But some nights, when the air is cold and the shadows stretch a little too far, I can still hear that voice. Good choice. And I wonder if, one day, it might change its mind.